Hello, everybody, and welcome to another segment of IDAGIO Live, where classical music happens. I'm Claire Huangci, and I'm thrilled to be back with another episode of Conversations with Claire. I took a one-week break because I came back to Germany and I was in quarantine, but it's great to be back with you all. Thank you for tuning in. Every evening, there are live chats, live performances, even short master classes with different artists around the world, and you can tune in only on IDAGIO Live. And today, now I would like to welcome my guest, Haochen Zhang. Thank you so much for joining us, Haochen.
Hello, great to be here.
Yeah, it's so great. So I'm in Germany, and where are you speaking to us from today?
Yeah, I'm at my home in Philadelphia.
Wonderful. Yeah, actually, I was also very close to Philadelphia just about 2 weeks ago. So it's nice to see
cool.
that we can stay connected even across the oceans. Haochen is my classmate from Curtis, first and foremost for me. I've known him more than half of my life, and it's such a pleasure to have him today talk with me about the Prokofiev Concerto No. 2. In fact, when I think of this piece, I do affiliate you with it. Not only do you have a great new CD out, which we're going to be discussing, but this was also the piece you performed in the finals of the 2009 Clyburn competition, is that right? And you won. So it's kind of like a winning piece for you. And for me personally, this is one of my favorite concertos, and it's one of the concertos that has stayed with me the longest, accompanied me also almost half my life. So it's a pleasure to talk about it today. And how about with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your personal connections with the piece so far?
Well, I first started, I think, about 2007 when I was about 16, 17. Yeah, and then, I mean, the Prokofiev second was really just starting to get popular in the last, I guess, 2 decades or so. So back then, for me, it was the cool thing to learn because it was so challenging. It was known to, you know, one of the most challenging pieces, not only in the concerto repertoire, but in the piano repertoire in general. So I was really curious back then, and not only because of the virtuosic part, the technicality, but also I think intellectually it's also very challenging. And it's not only that it sounds really modern and futuristic me back then, but I think even with the most modern pieces, there was always a besides the avant-garde harmonic or texture-wise kind of aspect, but I think all those modern pieces usually have a sense of unifying structure, a sense of coherence. But this piece for me back then was, at least on the surface, so incoherent. I was trying to make sense of it, you know. So the virtuosic exuberance part was one, but also how do you make sense of the narrative, and all these kind of different sections that on the surface seems to, you know, not connect with one another, not coherent with one another. So that was I think the big thing for me was really yeah.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I remember, I mean, we were both in Curtis at that same time, and I learned this also when I was in Curtis, that yes, it was the cool piece to learn. It was somehow it was suddenly the concerto, which is harder than Rachmaninoff 3. And for us before, it was always Rachmaninoff 3 is the concerto for elephants, but suddenly there was this new piece which few people were playing, but whoever could play it, it showed real nerve. And yeah, absolutely, I would love to hear your first impressions of the piece, because for me personally, I learned it, yes, because it was very, very much cool, and to practice the technique, I think to kind of improve the virtuosity just by learning the piece, it was a big driving force that made me learn it. But actually, it was a piece, I have to say, which I kind of grew up listening to, because my father, he had the CD, in fact, with Ashkenazy, and André Previn and LSO. And this was something he was always playing in the car. And I was really young. And when you're like a 9-10-year-old and you're just kind of getting your head around Mozart and Beethoven, at least I was. It was like, what is this? Sometimes it really sounded a bit like noise. But then when I actually ended up learning it, it was already in my ear. And I think I was quite lucky because there's so many notes. So if you're learning it cold without really hearing it, it's really challenging. How was it for you?
Well, I had quite a different experience because I've never actually listened to the piece until I was about 16. Okay. Yeah, and back then I think the only Prokofiev concerto. I mean, I've heard all the sonatas, but the concerto that was just Prokofiev third. So when the first time hearing Prokofiev second was a totally different experience. I mean, it's so different from the third.
Yeah. Had you already played? Did you play the third already before learning the second? Okay.
Yeah, I've already played the third. And you can immediately tell why the third is the popular one, the second was not. But so I was really in my brain just trying to make sense of it, not only just how technically it was so challenging, but just there's a lot of cerebral exercise that I need to go through when learning the piece, it's just a lot of not just the technical, intellectual information in it. And then I looked at the background and knowing that the premiere was after that he dedicated to a friend who had committed suicide, a friend of him in St. Petersburg College, and by the name of Maximilian Schmidhoff, and who actually wrote a letter to him right before he committed suicide. So I'm sure that has some kind of impact on him. Yeah. Yes. The premiere was an absolute disaster. I think Prokofiev himself was the soloist, and there were audience screaming after the piece, and somebody said that even cats on roof can make better music. So
yeah, but little bit like the Rite of Spring premiere. I mean, it's very interesting because I think there were actually two premieres, right? Prokofiev, in fact, he wrote this work starting in 1912, and his friend, I think really they were very close. They were a little bit closer than just acquaintances. They were best friends, and I think Prokofiev even said that Maximilian is the only one who really understands him, like his humor. And I think, of course, Maximilian also, you can just sense, like, yes, he wrote him a postcard, and the way it was worded was quite, I don't know what I would do if I ever got something like this. It basically said, to share the news, I have shot myself. Please, don't think about it too much. The reasons are not important. Take it easy. And Prokofiev himself then went to Finland he wasn't sure if this was true. And he saw him with his own eyes, like his body. And then he was forced to go back to Russia and tell Maximilian's mother. I mean, so many emotions. And then I think he completed this piece, which was then premiered in Russia, and it didn't go too well, like you said. And then many years later, he actually he went back to it because the original was lost, right? And then he made a new version.
I think it was destroyed by a fire during the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
And he had to rewrite it. I think it was 1913 when the piece was first composed, and that's also the year Maximilian died.
Yes.
But in 1923, so it was 10 years later that he had to rewrite the piece. And I used to write like a long essay, and then something happened to my computer, so I have to rewrite it. And it was such a painful experience, so I could not imagine how to write Concerto 10 years afterwards. And maybe that's why it was almost completely rewritten, that Prokofiev himself claimed that it was almost can be considered his fourth concerto.
And that's also very interesting that we just want to highlight. In fact, this version that we know and the version that we're going to be listening to, on your CD is actually written after Prokofiev #3. And that's why also I didn't know that at first. So when I was listening to #2, when I was working on it, I was thinking, this sounds more modern than #3. I mean, it sounds more complex. And now I understand it's because actually he did write it after #3. Yeah, a very interesting thing. So I think that's great. We've now given a little bit of the background. And in your opinion, Haochen, how important, like when you perform this piece, how important would you think it is for your audience to know this tragic story behind the composition?
Well, I mean, there were two kind of main impressions about the Prokofiev second. On one hand, people obviously, just like the audience during the premiere, sort of had this impression of absolute vulgarity and violence and grotesque. And in a way, that's the main impression. There was this is a piece about ugliness and violence. On the other hand, for some people, and including many of us who first learned the piece, that was the cool thing, and it was the virtuosity, the brilliance, and so forth. But I think underneath those surface impressions, actually, the piece itself contains so much mystery, and contrary to the violent aspect and the brutal sonorities, which it is true, but also I think underneath it's one of the most versatile and most detailed pieces I've ever seen. And there's so many nuance actually in it. So I always see this piece as a piece of duality. And on the one hand, there's the colossal and the violent, the grotesque, but also on the other side, there's the nuance in the details, and all the intricate inner voices that could be very interesting, and that leaves a lot of open interpretation for performers, which is why I don't think there is a set of a standard way of interpretation like many other pieces. So I think that the piece invites imaginations and owes to constant rediscovery.
So you also agree, because as I said, this is one of the pieces that I've also played throughout my last 15 or so years, that it changes with you, right? Like it's
exactly.
Many people, they say, of course, Beethoven's sonatas, they take a lifetime. Certain Chopin pieces also, it grows with you. Now, but I really would say this is one of the pieces that I have seen the interpretation has changed for me the most. Sometimes if I have ever heard my performance of it back from when I was 17 or 18, I would be like, no, like it's like opposite of what I do now. And for you, so you played this in the Clyburn finals, and it was very convincing, obviously. And then you recorded this, I guess 2 years ago. So quite a few years later. And can you tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, like what made you choose to record Prokofiev 2 coupled with Tchaikovsky 1, and a little bit about the recording process?
Well, this is my second album with BIS, the Swedish label, and the first album was a solo one. So the second, naturally, I wanted to make a concerto recording, but then I wanted to, since the first album was a lot Germanic centered, and so I wanted to choose something Russian for this my concerto album, and I think there could not be more sort of polar opposites in the Russian concerto genre than the Tchaikovsky 1, the Prokofiev 2. And I mean, the Tchaikovsky 1 is, of course, the most popular concerto ever written. But also, while Prokofiev is gaining more popularity, but it's much more provocative than Tchaikovsky. So, but I think that the nature of it, and not just in terms of reputation, but the nature was so opposite. Tchaikovsky is the ultimate example of warmth, romanticism, and there was, in a way, it's a very straightforward piece. I mean, you can feel that music just keeps pouring out of his heart, out of his mind. And Prokofiev, on the other hand, is not warm at all in his second concerto, and also it's not straightforward. It's as I said, there was constant questions and twists, and disjunctions, and also I think Tchaikovsky is somewhat light. I mean, the sonority is definitely heavy, but I'm talking about the nature and the spirit.
The message is
light, exuberant, and uplifting one. And Prokofiev, on the other hand, is quite catastrophic. So I think there's going to be a lot of tension between just juxtaposing these two pieces together. And for me, it's also quite a switch of mind. And so that's why I wanted to, record.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting combination. I actually had a listen, and in your CD, the first one is Prokofiev 2, and then it's followed by Tchaikovsky 1, and it segues so nicely. It's almost like when the Tchaikovsky starts, you almost feel a sense of relief.
Yeah.
And it's actually a great combination. I have never really heard it like that, but it was fantastic. I wanted to discuss a little bit also. We already said that this is a piece which is gaining in popularity for the last 2 decades. And I have to say, what I have noticed is that it really gains popularity, yes, in the concert stage, absolutely. Although definitely when it comes to the choice of programming Prokofiev 3 or even Prokofiev 1, usually that would be preferable to programming Prokofiev 2 by a lot of organizers.
Yeah.
Yet, it has really become a milestone, I think, for many, many students in music Hochschules here in Germany. And also, I think in our time in Curtis, like everybody wanted to learn it. In Juilliard, everyone wanted to learn it. And in competitions, it is extremely popular.
Yeah.
Is there any advice that maybe we could give to some of the students nowadays who want to learn the piece? I'm back in Germany, and I've met some of the students in the Hanover School, and yes, right now it's really lockdown period, and many of them, they're working with their teachers, perhaps digitally, but it's a time also for them that they have all the freedom to learn many pieces. And a lot of the students I talked to, they said like, yeah, we're learning Rachmaninoff 3 and Prokofiev 2. So if you have any advice, that would be great.
Well, I think, as I said, the piece will be a constant evolution process for the students and musicians alike. And I think you always find new things. And so I don't believe that you would just learn it and put it aside. I think the piece will come back by itself. I mean, if you're interested. My advice would be, of course, the technical part is one thing, but just how to understand the narrative. For instance, why is the cadenza in the first movement so long? It's almost disproportionately long. I mean, it's longer than 50% of the
half. Yeah, it's half.
Yeah. I mean, the first entrance is sort of romantic-like. But it's not very long, and then he moves on to the second theme, which has nothing to do with the romantic sort of nature depiction like the first theme. But if that does not make weird sense enough, and then he started going immediately into this cadenza, and for such a long time, only to build it to the very end, which is orchestra enters with this massive, complete contrast, but which is the same of the beginning, because the beginning, the bassoon starts in a very soft way. But when the beginning comes back after this long journey of cadenza, it comes in an opposite fashion, almost like a roar of nature. So I think that's going to be I think the meaningful discovery for students. How do we make sense of the journey, for instance, and also, for instance, the second movement. Why does he write in such a original fashion, that it's almost just with no harmony and support. That's the part I always feel it's the most scary part, actually, is to perform not the cadenza part, but right afterwards to go into the mood of the second movement. Also, physically, it's so challenging.
Absolutely.
Because you are so exhausted already after the cadenza. So
after the first movement, it already feels like this piece should be. It can be over, because it was so massive. I mean, I also think I agree very much. Of course, from a technical standpoint, you can learn so much from it. You can kind of reach your limits, test your limits, overcome them. But it's a piece which, for me, I learned a lot about stamina, about planning, about finding the architecture of the piece. Like you said very well, this first movement, it's about 10, 11 minutes, but it's really built up of the very first theme, which comes back in the very end. And I think the very first melody, it's one of the two melodies that we have in this cadenza, because this is, in this concerto, because this is a concerto where really, I think Prokofiev, he didn't write so many melodies, but in this concerto, the whole 30-some minute piece, there are two melodies which we can sing, actually. So one is in the very beginning of the concerto, and the one is in the middle of the fourth movement. And because of that, the rest of it, it's very hard to delineate, to kind of make sense of all the notes and to really still show a very large architecture, a big picture. And that, I think, was actually probably the most interesting thing when I was learning the piece too. And I would only say for a young student to learn it as soon as possible. It's something that will stay in your fingers then forever. And I'm so happy that back when we were in Curtis, we had this chance and we were able to learn so many big pieces at a very young age. And that just leads us very smoothly into the beginning of this work. So we can start listening perhaps to the very opening of Haochen's of your concerto album. Fantastic. I like so much how very beginning where it starts, for me, it always sounds like an elegy, like the beginning of a legend. There's this massive force that's coming from a distance and it's unstoppable, I always feel this intensity, even from the very opening, which in comparison to later the cadenza, it just sounds so melodic and beautiful. But when the orchestra comes in, it's totally chromatic and it just sounds like it's sticky. It's truly at one with the piano, and that's great. I think it's a piece which, of course, I think for a lot of Prokofiev, most of the Prokofiev concertos, the orchestra is always, it has an equal role. But in the concerto number 3, I always had the feeling it was somewhat like piano against orchestra, a little bit. And this one, the piano and the orchestra they have to mesh together perfectly. I mean, when you recorded this with, it was the Lahti Orchestra, is that right?
Lahti.
When you worked with them, how was it? Did you have a lot of time to actually rehearse and then to come up with an interpretation together? Or had you played it already with them before?
Well, I record both Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev separately. And for the Prokofiev, we did a performance right before the recording. So I think we started recording right after the concert the day before. So that was really good thing because we sort of let it loose in the concert, and then we kind of reorganize into recording because the concert and recording experience are so different. But the concert I think allows both the orchestra and me and the conductor to be just free and just be in the music without thinking about the precisions of so many of the recording thing. But during the recordings, actually, I mean, needless to say, this is not just a challenging thing for the pianist, but also extremely challenging for the orchestra. I'm thinking about the second movement, for example. The orchestra plays just as an important role, if not more important, to the music than the piano. So so a lot of things which we just need to work it out, and also in terms of interpretation. For instance, I don't think we're going to play that, but in the last bar of the first movement, do we make a ritardando, or do we go straight? So even that, me and the conductor had a quite long discussion how to make best sense of it, especially after long cadenza, and things like that. I would say.
Yeah, I mean that's incredible because this is a piece where I would say after a concert, it's already exhausting, but then to record, which is for me always more intense than in a concert. In a concert, we have this live feeling, we have the audience's energy also. No matter what, like stepping on a stage, you immediately have adrenaline. And in a recording studio, you have to give more, I would say, definitely more than even in a concert. You're trying to reach people with a barrier of a recording. So you were then recording this concerto. How was it for you actually in the cadenza? Because I think the cadenza in particular, you did then separately, right? Or with
I did separately.
Okay. And it must have been also just you had to pace yourself, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think that we are going to listen to a bit of your cadenza. Well, most of it actually. It's technically the place. I think it's really like a litmus test for many pianists. Many times it's like if someone's playing Prokofiev 2, you would say, oh, let's hear the cadenza. But this is, yes, it's a total of about 5 minutes, but I think it's, for me, I would always see it as a 5-minute crescendo. We're growing into the orchestra re-entrance. And this theme, which we had heard just in the beginning, this is the central motive in the cadenza. So being able to somehow snake it out of all the thicket of notes, that's really the main challenge. And now we're going to listen to almost your entire cadenza. And we're going to then go back and we show how the very ending of the first movement is the very beginning of the concerto, actually. So let's sit back and enjoy. gets me every time, this cadenza, I have to say. I would be so interested to know how it was in the very first version that he premiered, which was lost, if there was also this massive cadenza. Yeah. For me, yeah, under all of these virtuosic fireworks, I mean, this is something, we didn't see it, but it's such a physical place. I mean, we're basically encompassing the very bottom of the keyboard to the very top, up and down, crossing hands. I mean, it's basically a workout. But under that, we can also hear the desperation, the agony. And when the orchestra comes in, it sounds almost like, you know, a raw, earthy cry to the heavens of why. But then there's this resignation afterwards, and it ends in this, back in the elegy. Yeah, absolutely beautiful. And yes, now let's go into the second movement, because we have now heard, this is the end of the first movement, and in the second movement, it's a perpetuum mobile, and it's about 2.5 minutes, and the pianist is just non-stop playing. And was there some way that you had to practice this? Because I think this is, for all pianists, they have to overcome a significant technical hurdle in order to play this, to sound like it's easy. It cannot sound like we're struggling, and it is a struggle. But did you do anything special to prepare?
Well, during the performance, usually what happens for me is that after the first movement, I'll do something like wiping the keyboard and my sweat, and just something actually, but as an excuse to make me relax a little bit, because not only physically it's so exhausting after the cadenza, but also mentally, you have to switch to a totally different world. We'll hear in how the second movement starts. I mean, as you mentioned, the cadenza is all over the place, and explores the full range and sonority of the piano. And that's something that we as pianists, who usually plays a lot of romantic repertoire, which has a lot of harmony and a lot of bass support, that's more comfortable as in comparison to the second movement, which is devoid of harmony. And when you're just playing basically a single line doubled by an octave, but it's almost this sudden suspension of everything else, because the orchestra is playing the harmonic parts.
It must be a big jolt. It's really weird, right? That we're practicing it all the time on this unisono, and then in the end, when we suddenly play with orchestra, it's like, wow, that's interesting, and it's so important. I think the orchestra part really affects also our interpretation.
Exactly, you have to understand the orchestra, and that's what the narrative really lies in. It's in the orchestra part, so this whole worldliness of the cadenza, and then suddenly you were just playing a single line. For me, that's also a mental and psychological switch, and you feeling like you're suddenly just running, not just walking on rope, but you're like running on a rope. So it's a feeling of danger. And that adds to this the scariness, but also the excitement, I think.
Not only like a nervous energy. But I'm curious, like one of our colleagues, a pianist, he said to me that when he was learning this piece, he used to get up in the morning and go straight to the piano, like didn't matter when it was, and he would just play the second movement once through, cold. And he did that, he said, like, honestly, every day for a month or so, in order to know that he can play it at the drop of a hat. Because this is one where it's so important to kind of keep relaxed. And I can imagine it's definitely one of those movements that can cause injuries with the wrong type of practice. I mean, when I was learning it, I had to really experiment with different fingerings all the time. And it's quite uncomfortable. There are places where it's really not very pianistic. And both hands, of course, they're different, but they're playing the same thing. So some parts which are uncomfortable for the right hand might work better for the left hand, and vice versa. And in order to do that, I mean, you had to really come up with kind of creative ways to overcome the difficulty. And actually, it was always a relief for me when there was an orchestra, because suddenly it's like, oh, you can get a little bit out of the focus of only listening to yourself. But let's listen to a little bit of your second movement. a lot because you bring out a lot of these like kind of polyrhythms, like together with the orchestra. And while yes, it is a perpetuum mobile, obviously we're playing nonstop the same rhythms, that you really show us kind of the correlation together with the orchestra. Yeah, it's really great. Was there anything else you wanted to highlight about this, the recording experience? I guess I'm interested to know, were you recording this many times in one take or a little bit different?
Oh, the second movement definitely revolves in a lot of takes, simply because of just getting the togetherness with the orchestra. And that's the part where I think most audience wouldn't know about, which is that in a performance, I think because of the overall sort of echo of the hall, and you hear just how the piece is cohesively coming out together as one sonority. But in recording experience, actually every different even set of violin has a different mic. So if someone a tiny bit off, or if the strings and the woodwinds are a tiny bit not together with the piano, then we need to do the whole thing together.
Okay.
So
wow.
That's okay for the, it's not a big problem for the other movements, but in the second movement, as you can see how it relies on the diversities and independence of each voice, even within the orchestra, that can cause a big problem. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, so were you playing it many times, like the whole as a whole, the whole second movement many times?
We did it because for the sake of safety.
Yeah.
So we did it about 2 or 3 times, and then.
Okay. Yeah, because I would guess if you're doing like smaller cuts, even the slightest tempo, it's not able to put together. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So we need to hear that we don't hear a different tempo. Yeah.
Exactly. Great. Well, let's go through, because the third movement is it's an intermezzo. For me, I always hear ballet music when I hear this third movement. I particularly, the very opening, I'm strongly reminded of Romeo and Juliet, Montagues and Capulet, for example. And there are so many moments in it where I could see a ballerina in front of me. How was it for you when you played it?
I had different stages of how I imagine the beginning, for instance. Of course, I had this imagination about this relation with Romeo and Juliet, but sometimes also, actually, it's during the recording experience when Dr. says, maybe how about playing in a slower tempo, the orchestra to start. And then I suddenly had a different, that's why I think this piece is an open question. When it's played a little bit heavily, I suddenly, think about another different set, almost like an ancient tale, like in the Lord of the Rings, those monsters from the Kingdom of Mordor, these semi-human, semi-monster, and they were sort of marching in this absolute grotesque environment, and that releases this kind of demonic energy. So I think you can interpret it in different ways, and that's part of the intrigue and the charm of the third movement. I think the third one is the most fascinating because it has so much different elements. I mean, you go from the primitive and to the sarcastic, sinister. But at certain point,
really delicate moments.
Yeah, but at a certain point, as I'm sure you know, when there is this downward glissando part, where suddenly the string has this silk road kind of texture and timbre that almost is lustrous. So there's a lot of different. So I think it's completely up to the pianist and the listener's imagination. Yeah.
Absolutely. We're running a little bit low on time, so I'm thinking that maybe we can go already into the fourth movement so we can get just a little taste. Let's hear the end of the fourth movement, pretty much the last movement. And this is also how the fourth movement starts. This is a piece about cycles, and that will end our session on a real triumphant note, I think. Hear the last part of the fourth movement. Super exciting. Thank you so much for sharing your insights about this Prokofiev 2, and thank you for the fiery, tempestuous performance. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Haochen.
Always a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you out there listening to our show today. And please join us in the future. I'm here every Tuesday, Conversations with Claire, and every night there are many, many interesting shows with many wonderful colleagues and musicians. We've put together a little playlist for you, and it includes, of course, Haochen's CD of Prokofiev 2 and Tchaikovsky 1, and as well as Ashkenazy's, some performances by André, the Prokofiev Sonata No. 4, which is also dedicated to Maximilian Schmidhoff, Romeo and Juliet, and many more. And you can feel free to listen to that, and they're all available on IDAGIO. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Haochen.